Can you hear me? Oh, glasses. Ah, there. And where do we have the presentation? Could you please? Ah, there we are. The magic of science and technology. Commandant, generals, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, I should say first that the fine print down here, this is not the Swedish government's view, this is not the FI's view, it is my view. As you know, eternal peace lasted only 25 years, and so did the unipolar world. And few anymore deny that we have a new geopolitical rivalry with several components. One is rich and powerful China wanting more, not only of the South China Sea, but also they are challenging the entire post-1945 system and the global role of the United States as an underwriter of that system. In Europe, Putin wants to make Russia great again. One might say that we had plans for a common European house. Well, Volodya has driven a tank through it and shattered the cooperative order agreed after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and seeks to replace it with something more resembling the Yalta system. Thus, we are in some kind of Cold War, not ideological as old, but for the lack of a better term. But we are not only in a Cold War, we are also in a flux. Because what were long dependable constants in the international order and in our conceptual security paradigm have become variables. This could be compared to a series of earthquakes followed by a flash flood. The landscape is being transformed, things are breaking, moorings are coming loose, and everything is becoming fluid. And this is not only because the US is seriously considering abandoning the role that it has fulfilled since 1945 of what you might call a benevolent hegemon, final arbiter, and ultimate underwriter of the order. It is also because the rebellion that Trump represents is part of a wider populist rebellion against the liberal hegemony in the entire West. So we have not only Trump, we have Brexit, Orban, the Five-Star Movement in Italy, the peace government in Poland, and the ground is shaking under Angela Merkel. Thus, those of us that live in this part of the world have to prepare for confrontation with Russia without knowing whether we can really count on the US or on NATO, or for that matter, and for what it's worth, on the EU. And this leads to a two-track approach for my comments here today. The first part will be on dealing with the Russian grab for the Baltic states in case Article 5 can be trusted and the US and NATO are engaged. The second part will be on the problems a small state faces in deterring a large and aggressive neighbor when outside support is far from certain. And, as you know, Sweden is not a member of NATO. It's often said that the Baltics have become the new Fulda Gap, the center of attention, the point where the confrontation gravitates to. And since RAND published its now famous study 3 years ago, almost every think tank in the West have studied and wargamed what might happen if Russia tried to grab one of the Baltic states or all three. And this is, of course, because if Putin wanted to demonstrate that Russia is powerful and ruthless, while NATO is weak and a paper tiger, this region might seem like a tempting possibility. NATO's forces in place are weak, while Russia can amass forces on the border to create an advantage in time and space. The nightmare scenario, here it's being called Skaparotti's nightmare, is, of course, Russia moving in quickly, creating a fait accompli, and then declaring that they will defend the newly acquired territory with all means at their disposal, including nukes. And this would place NATO at the horns of a dilemma. Either back down, accept the loss of three members of the alliance, and drift into obscurity and impotence, or gear up for a reconquest, a major operation that might turn into a nuclear war. Now, since the 1990s, as you know, the defense of the alliance territory is no longer based on a strong forward presence, but on a capability for rapid reinforcement of threatened allies. However, However, the reinforcements of the Baltics would be an obstacle course perhaps under fire, with at least 4 major hurdles to cross. First, having suitable and available ready units to send. Second, making the decision to reinforce. Third, transporting these through Europe, and that, as we know, is no piece of cake. And fourth, getting past Russia's A280 assets in Kaliningrad. Now, one option for avoiding the A280 assets is to reroute air power and air transport through Swedish airspace, and also to forward-base tactical aircraft in Sweden, as was done in the RAND study. But then, the next Russian chess move might be to grab the island of Gotland, and thus plugging a hole in the ring. And deploying anti-aircraft missiles, anti-ship missiles there. This scenario is so well known in the analytic community that it is nowadays called the Gotland grab. And it is being taken seriously by both the Swedish authorities and by the alliance. And this scenario is a major reason why we decided to put a permanent garrison on the island again, why Gotland draws high-level visitors from the US, for example, the Chief of Staff of the US Army, and why Gotland was one of the focal points for the large-scale exercise Aurora in 2017. And the instrumental value of Swedish territory and airspace in a conflict in the Baltic region is one of the reasons why Sweden no longer thinks that it can remain outside a war in the region, why defense spending is increasing, and why defense ties to the US, to Finland, and to others are being significantly strengthened. However, before turning on to the second subject, I want to present you with a bit of a teaser. In my mind, Russia's A280 capabilities are seriously overrated. It's very easy to draw a red ring on a map like I just had done. It's a totally other thing to hit a moving object 400 kilometers away. The Earth is still round, while radar beams travel in a straight line. So we have a major report debunking some of the myths of Russian A280, which now is in the final stage of editing, and it will hopefully be published within a month or 6 weeks. So watch this space. The name of the draft report is Bursting the Bubble. Now, turning to the second theme, the small states in the Nordic-Baltic region have to urgently raise the threshold against Russian aggression or intimidation, but we can no longer safely assume that America or NATO will promptly come to our aid if we are threatened. This is not to say that America will totally abandon its allies or Europe. While that is a possibility that can no longer be dismissed, it's too early to call it a certainty. But it seems rather clear that it can no longer safely be assumed that the cavalry will promptly come if we are in trouble. Prudence thus calls for thinking through such situations and what we can do about them. And this includes what small states can do for themselves to strengthen deterrence and defense by, first, increasing the chances of outside intervention, and secondly, by raising the price that an aggressor would have to pay. And this current Nordic-Baltic predicament is, of course, a subset of a classic problem in strategy, how the weak can deter the strong. And traditionally, in Sweden, Finland, and Norway, the answer has been by a dogged defense of home territory that raises the price for an aggressor if he tries to occupy us, a hedgehog approach that is not really true deterrence by denial, but actually a mix of deterrence by punishment and denial, because we don't aim to block the aggressor, we aim to raise the price. But at least Sweden and Norway no longer has anything like the force structures required to attempt this kind of strategy. You have 1 brigade, we have 2. So it would be almost impossible to conduct the type of defense that we planned for during the Cold War, when you had 13 brigade and we had 30. Moreover, since the end of the Cold War, as the minister said, our societies have become much more vulnerable, while Russia's capabilities for long-range precision strike have become a threat. And thus, it might be possible for an aggressor to paralyze our societies without a single enemy putting his boots on our soil. And as the objective of an aggressor may not be to occupy us, but to force concessions from us, this is a highly relevant scenario. For example, hitting the electric grid. If you cut electricity, computers go down, telecoms go down, nothing works. And another scenario that cannot be discounted after Crimea and Donbass is a limited land grab of, for example, Gotland or parts of Finnmark, as well as the use of hybrid tactics. And at least in Sweden, this conundrum has been highlighted in the post-Crimea scramble to raise the threshold against Russian aggression. One of the results has been an increased interest in non-traditional strategies, such as striking back at the aggressor, deep strike, deliberate escalation, or deterrence by punishment, depending on which term you want to use. Now, the strategic rationale is that it is both imperative to increase the chances of outside help and to clearly exact a price for aggression. And by striking back, we show that aggression is taking place and that we are defending ourselves. By striking back where it hurts and by deliberately escalating the conflict, we make certain that the aggressor has to pay a price, and we make sure that the conflict cannot be ignored in the capitals that count. And history also shows that projecting an image of the brave small guy standing up to the bully is often crucial in securing outside support. Having the capability to escalate and to improve the prospects for pulling in others also greatly complicates the pre-conflict calculus of a power contemplating an attack. And the means for striking back, many of us have been accustomed to there being an exclusive resource only available to the US or Israel. Well, 30 years have passed since the 1991 Gulf War, and what was then an exclusive resource only for the US has become something you can almost buy over the counter. And it's cheap, comparatively. So, and militarily, the logic behind striking back is also pretty clear and straightforward. We cannot defend, thus we must counterattack. And if we counterattack, we choose the time, the place, and the means. This makes for better economy of force and also denies the aggressor a monopoly on the initiative. We can exploit his vulnerabilities and sensitive points, thereby also forcing him to hedge against what we might do, and it denies the enemy running the conflict on his chosen terms. Now, there are, of course, also drawbacks with this kind of strategy, and usually more traditionally minded people are quick to point these out. This approach is deeply counterintuitive to many in the Nordic strategic establishments who have been steeped in a hunker-down mentality and thinking only in terms of defense by denial. It must be remembered that any capabilities that we might acquire will still be minuscule compared to Russia's, and also to Russia's tolerance for absorbing punishment. And as the saying goes, it's risky to poke a bear without being able to kill it. And finally, the capability for counterstrikes might act as a magnet for preemptive strikes. That said, there's much to say for adding an element or two of proactive counterstrikes to our toolbox. Thank you.